is our third of 9, and we are getting ready for our second presentation by Doug Harman. Doug's a true friend. If you look in Webster, look that up, you'll see his picture right there at Friend, so we really cherish him. Doug's experience is as a consultant currently, writer and public speaker, Harman Consulting, from 2007 to 608, interim president of CEO of Arlington CVB, 1089 to 1206, president and CEO of Fort Worth Convention Visitors Bureau, 385 to 1089, city manager of Fort Worth, 176 to 285, city manager of Alexandria, Virginia, 373 to 1275, deputy county executive, Fairfax County, Virginia, director of Office of Research and Statistics, 171 to 273, director of Research and Development Center, special assistant to the director in International City Management Association, 866 to 71, associate professor, American University, Washington, D.C., assistant professor of the university.
That's plenty.
That is
the rest of
and he has education, par excellence, and memberships out the kazoo.
Yeah.
Here we have, and
okay.
We have your little.
Here, let me put that somewhere. Just aim that.
Did you get yours?
Yeah, here it's right here, I think. Yeah. Okay. Well, I appreciate the introduction and the kazoo. I worked many years to get the kazoo going. Okay, so right there. Okay, all right. Okay. So if you can hear me, if you can't, you're probably better off. But I appreciate having intellectuals here. Rick has always told me that he was one, so I know we have one. But Harold Lawrence and his wife Elizabeth are in the back. If you'd wave your hand. And Harold and Elizabeth have the Museum of the Americas. And he has offered that each time I misstate something about Native Americans, he will stand up and boo. And so you can get the correct information from him later on. Well, anyway, with my 10 minutes, obviously I'm really pleased to talk about another kind of issue of multicultural aspects of the Camp Bowie in Fort Worth. And as one looks at it's the code talkers, and in particular the Choctaw code talkers, you really need to kind of look at it in the context of the whole experience with Native Americans in the United States. And in fact, in this slide about the warrior traditions, as we go through all of this, kind of think about what they went through from the standpoint of how the U.S. government treated them, to the point where some of them became really very significant in World War I. And the other thing that is important, kind of the second aspect, is really how, in fact, the impact of World War I on the Native Americans, not just the Choctaws, but all of the Native Americans who, in fact, served in the military. In fact, as we go through all of this, think about the parallels to what Rick presented, which was really a good presentation, but how Native Americans were treated compared to the African Americans. And there's some clear parallels and some very great differences between the two. Well, if you go on to the next slide, actually Clara and Bob they head up the AV division of this presentation, so we appreciate Clara. Wave your hand or wave something. Okay, yeah, she was a wave in her previous life, not exactly, but anyway, if you go back to Trail of Tears, it's one of the defining features, really, of how the U.S. government treated, in fact, the Native Americans, and very specifically how the Choctaws were treated during this period of time. So the question becomes, how did these people who were so badly treated by the U.S. government, then becomes really brave soldiers in World War I and later in World War II. In any event, in fact, during the Trail of Tears, the Choctaws were some of the first major tribe that Andrew Jackson forced out in the removal after the 1830 Removal Act was approved. In fact, actually, number 45 in the White House currently, Andrew Jackson is his favorite president. Well, Andrew Jackson was the one that really set in motion Trail of Tears. During the Trail of Tears, 2,500 Choctaws died during that movement from Mississippi, from Louisiana, and from other states. So it was just a horrible, horrible kind of movement that took place during that period of time. So the Choctaws became then eventually the first code talkers, but there were other tribes as well. But just a word about who were the Choctaws. The Choctaws were part of the Mississippi civilization of Native Americans who were very sophisticated, and in fact, when they first came in contact with the white settlers, they were very anxious and did in fact cooperate with them and tried to get along with them. They did not fight the settlers. And so it's kind of really sad to see what eventually, happened to them. The Choctaws were, in fact, it's the Mississippi culture was just an amazing one, and with so many parallels to really what also had happened in Mexico. Literally their pyramids that they built were just really incredible. Well, the Choctaws also were important because they had fought for the United States government in a number of the wars, and it wasn't until the Civil War where there was a division of not fighting and not being patriotic, really, which took place during this period of time. Well, the Dawes Act in 1889 or 1887 was a key element that really also was part of the abuse of the Native Americans and affected these people who eventually became, soldiers in World War I. There was 90 million acres of land taken away from the Native Americans during this period after the Dawes Act, and this was when, in fact, it was the U.S. government trying to eliminate the tribal structure of the Native American tribes, and also to further what the U.S. government wanted to do as far as putting a lot of the land that treaties had given to the Indian tribes and take that land and make it available for the white settlers. So it was pretty drastic. But a key part here related really to the issue of Choctaws and others becoming soldiers, that part of this entire transition really took away the manhood of the Native American men, because they were no longer, obviously the buffaloes were taken away. They no longer could in fact pursue the things that defined them as men, and they were put into the reservation. So the warrior traditions were taken away. So with regard to the military, there's an interesting parallel, kind of back to some of what Rick was also talking about. The Native Americans, many of the tribes, in fact, fought with the United States Army. Obviously some fought against, but there was going back to the Revolutionary War and the War of 1812 and so forth, many of the Native Americans, in fact, fought with the United States government. So they had been soldiers, had been with the Army. However, the Army leaders over this period of time had really mixed feelings and some very negative feelings about Native Americans being part of the Army. And in fact, it was General Sheridan who said, "The only good Indian was a dead Indian." And during his period after the Civil War, he in fact insisted that Native Americans not be part of the Army. Well, after Sheridan's period of leadership went away, the Army, in fact, as Rick talked about the 9th and 10th and the 24th and the 25th regiments that were black units, there were, in fact, Indian units that were also formed during this kind of the late 1800s. And it was, viewed at the time by the Army as kind of an experiment. Well, the experiment actually worked pretty well. Now, through the earlier periods, the Native Americans served particularly as scouts and trackers. In fact, it was General Pershing who used them in 1916 when they were chasing Pancho Villa in Mexico. So there was a lot of use of the Native Americans in the military. However, there was great concern about the officers, the leaders of the Army, concerned about alcoholism, literacy, and so forth, not thinking that the Native Americans would not be good soldiers. So that brings us up to World War I. So in World War I, with the draft, technically the only people that could be drafted, it was said, were citizens of the United States. Well, the issue of who were citizens in the world of Native Americans was very, very confusing, because some citizenship had been granted, but the rights of citizens really were not enjoyed by many of those that had in fact been given citizenship. So it was really a mixed kind of bag. Well, going on to the next slide, I think the Caddo Sells this is the picture of him, and this is kind of brings us back to a very Fort Worth kind of story as well. The Bureau of Indian Affairs was an organization that goes back really to the time of George Washington, where the federal government set up an agency that was to relate to the Native Americans in terms of, because the Native Americans were, they were wards of the state. And so this was the agency of the federal government that dealt with the wards of the state. Well, Caddo Sells, he actually grew or was prominent in national politics from Iowa, and then moved to Fort Worth. In 1913, President Woodrow Wilson appointed him to be the head of the Bureau, the BIA, the Bureau of Indian Affairs. And so Caddo Sells was a very major businessman right here, and he then took a tremendous interest in the Native Americans and the ones serving at Camp Bowie. At this time, really his view was progressive in some ways, but also really hewing to the view of the national government and how Native Americans should be treated. And he was against having, and going back to Rick's presentation, he was against having all Native American units. He wanted them integrated into the Army, and this is one of these deviations between how blacks were treated and how Indians were treated. So, in fact, being right here, he visited the soldiers. I think you can go on to maybe the next slide. And in fact, here he is with some of the Native Americans at Camp Bowie. And so he really pressed the Army so that the Army didn't do to the Native Americans what they did to the black soldiers. And it's really interesting that, you had a lot of the same kinds of issues that when Rick talked about the medical examinations and the language issues and things like that. They were similar issues, but also the Native Americans, kind of like actually the black soldiers, had excellent physiques where, they, in fact, in the athletic competitions, they were, excelled. So they were really, in a lot of ways, very much excellent as kind of excellent, in condition to be soldiers. Well, the other issue with Native Americans, which was important, was given this backdrop, the Trail of Tears, and the other kind of issues, The question at the time in 1916-17 was, would the Native Americans participate in the war effort? Would they support the war? And there were people who really believed that they would not because of this background. Well, it turned out really the opposite, and again, kind of paralleling what Rick said, that in fact there were 12,000 Native Americans who were in fact joined the Army. 6,500 were in fact drafted, so you would presume those were citizens. But the other 6,000 or so, roughly, many of those did not have citizenship, and the ones that did have citizenship hadn't been treated as citizens anyway. So in any case, the 12,000 was a higher proportion of get this right, there was the highest proportion of males, 1/4 of all Native American males joined the Army or became soldiers, and that was higher than any other kind of segment of the population. So there was unlike the concerns about whether they would support the war effort, they very much did support the war effort. And a big part of that was the opportunity to be warriors again. When they had been killed, really, their ability to be warriors, now they had a warrior opportunity, and that was very, very significant. Well, in Camp Bowie, at the 36th Infantry Division, there were 13 different tribes that were represented there as soldiers, and they were represented into all kinds of types of unit, training for military. Well, this brings us to the code talkers, which I think is here's a picture of the ones who in fact became code talkers. And this is really a fascinating story, because if you go back to what the federal government was doing to quote unquote civilize the Native Americans, one of those elements was do not speak your native languages. I mean, in addition to not having a tribal structure. In fact, the young Native Americans who went to school were punished if the teachers heard them speaking their native languages. So this is as the soldiers, the Indian soldiers came in, they came in a kind of the context of don't bring your Native American traditions or your languages with you, because we don't want that. The irony then becomes it's their native language that becomes the tactic or the military importance of having the Native Americans. So that's one of the great ironies of this whole story. Well, in any case, this brings us to why did this happen? Why was the code talking? Why did it happen? And when the soldiers, the U.S. soldiers, got to the Meuse-Argonne offensive, which was kind of the major offensive when the U.S. soldiers got there. In fact, in World War I, the two sides had just exhausted themselves. I mean, it was such a horrible, horrible war, and with so many millions that died. And the lines, in fact, if any of you saw the All Quiet on the Western Front, I mean, it really reflected that the sadness. I mean, you'd have these huge loss of lives, and they'd only change lines by a few feet. Well, when the U.S. Army got there, it made the difference really, and forced kind of the end of the war after a number of months. The irony is, the further irony is that, maybe if the two sides had agreed to an armistice, maybe we would not have had the conditions that led to Hitler, in the 1930s. So, in any case, the U.S. Army coming was, spelled out the end. But at the time that the Army got there, they were having great difficulty because the Germans were intercepting their communications. And the communications came either through runners or through landlines or through radio. And so that's how they were communicating back and forth to the different units. Well, the Germans were intercepting that, and the American Army was very, very frustrated with that. So a Colonel Bloor, B-L-O-O-R, overheard a couple of the Choctaws talking, and the Choctaws heard him overhearing or saw him overhearing, and they were afraid they were going to be punished for having used their language. Well, Bloor then came up. He came up with the idea, well, could we use the Choctaw language as a way to keep the Germans from knowing what we're doing? Really kind of give him a lot of credit for coming up with the idea. And that's what then eventually led to the code talking that took place. In fact, Choctaws and other tribes and were brought in from the 141st, 142nd, and 143rd regiments of the 36th Division were recruited. Well, the first time that it was used, it was on October 26th. There was a strategic small retreat that the U.S. Army was planning to engage in. And what they wanted to do, they wanted to make sure the communications about the strategic retreat was not found out about by the Germans. So they used code talkers for communicating to the different units. And in fact, that strategic retreat went off beautifully and was successful. So immediately then the Army said, well, okay, we've got a good thing going. Let's expand this and use the code talkers for a general communications among the units. Well, one of the problems that they immediately got into was the problem of the Choctaws didn't deal with war tanks and grenades and things like that. So there was no language or no terminology that they had for those things. And in fact, their language was whole phrasistic, expressing in phrases different concepts, and they didn't have anything for these words. So what they had to do is immediately develop a vocabulary that would allow the Choctaws and the others to communicate. For example, the term machine gun became out of the Choctaw language. Little gun that shoots fast, kind of makes sense. And the concept of casualties was scalps. So that made a lot of sense too. 3rd Battalion, for example, was 3 grains of corn. That was the term they used for poison gas, bad air, really bad air, that's for sure. And grenade was the term stone. So those are the kinds of terminologies terms that they related to the Choctaw language. If you compare that then to the terminology used in World War II, they in fact had 600 different terms like that. So in World War II, what was used over a longer period of time, there was a large, dictionary that was in fact established for that. So in World War I, it was really just fairly simple. There were, let's see, I think here it is. Yeah, this was some of the soldiers who in fact were code talkers. And if you can see down below, there were Cherokees as well as Comanches, but the dominant number really were the Choctaws. And I think the Sioux were also there. But they proved to be very effective in several of the major battles. Saint and 10-day Forest Ferme were major battles where this was very important. The most significant one. This brings us to Joseph Oklahomby. And Joseph Oklahomby he was a code talker, but he was the most decorated soldier among the code talkers, and also the most decorated soldier in World War I from Oklahoma. So he was known, in fact, Rick mentioned Sergeant York. He was really the Sergeant York of the Native American world. And in fact, he and a group of 23 other soldiers were surrounded at one point by Germans, but they counterattacked and they captured a large number of German guns and German soldiers. In fact, they captured 171 soldiers and killed 79 during this really several-day battle. In fact, during this battle, Joseph crossed 200 yards of open area and was under fire by several machine guns. How he survived that, and one only can guess. But he was granted, in fact, that was the Croix de Guerre that you saw in that other uniform, the Croix de Guerre, and also the Silver Star. So he was, recognized by the military, right there soon after the end of the war. There's also an interesting little chapter about how the Germans viewed the Indians. Germany had a long tradition of being interested in Native Americans. Karl May, M-A-Y, had written a whole series of books about Texas and about Native Americans. And so the Germans were really quite knowledgeable about the Native Americans, and they admired them. They also feared them, so that when the German soldiers knew that there were units with a lot of Native Americans, there was some concern, and I suppose they wanted to keep their helmets down tight so they didn't lose any hair along the way. So it was, but anyway, back to the issue of the code talkers and the recognition of their success. At the end of World War I, the code talking activities were in fact kept a secret because the government did not want to reveal the success of that, which is one of the reasons why there was not more attention paid to them until 70 years later. So that, in fact, at the beginning, before World War II, Hitler sent professors. I suppose if Rick had been a German professor, he would have been sent by Hitler. I'm not saying anything bad about Rick, but no, okay, all right. But in any case, it's interesting that these professors were sent to study Native American languages with the idea that the U.S. government might use those languages in World War II. So, in any case, they weren't very successful. Actually, in World War II, Comanches were code talkers in the European front, and it was actually the Navajo that were the ones that famously became code talkers in the Pacific. And in fact, the Wind Talkers movie was the one that really brought a lot of attention to that. The delayed recognition was really kind of unfortunate and sad, because it was not until 1968 that the federal government, or the Army, really released full information about the code talkers. And it was not until 2008 that the tribes, all of the tribes that had code talkers in World War I and II were given the Congressional Medal of Honor. So not to individual code talkers, but to each of the tribes, which was really very, very fitting and well deserved. So when you look at, again, think about how the Native Americans are treated, how they embraced becoming warriors and were really very good warriors. In fact, back to scalping, those of us that have not much hair, we would have been really safe against the Germans. But in any case, one of the things after the war, I think there's another, okay. Here, in fact, this is the recognition of the code talkers that came 70 years after kind of the heroics and what was done in World War I. But one of the things that Sells allowed to happen at the end of the war was allowed the Native Americans to have some of their tribal events and dances to be, in fact, used again. And of course, there was the Scalp Dance that was one of their traditions. And it is verified that at least on one of the occasions of a Scalp Dance, one of the Native Americans did produce a German scalp. for that dance. So, the Germans had good reason to fear the Native Americans and all of that. But, well, so then, kind of wrapping all of this up, what did this do for Native Americans? Well, for them, it really created a renewed sense of pride because it allowed them to be warriors again. That was really, really very, very significant. After the war, they were allowed to have some of their customary things or their traditions and their dances to be done, so the kind of the elimination of all of that became less of a priority of the federal government, although it still remained as kind of the issue. The sad thing, though, is that during World War I, that many of the things that the Native Americans and their societies really depended upon in terms of health services and other things were diminished because of the war effort. So while there was a significant effort made to be part of the military, really the infrastructure of the support from the federal government to the Native American groups diminished and really created problems really that were very significant. On top of that, you had the Depression coming along, which then compounded all of those problems. But one of the other things that it did do on the positive side, it brought Native Americans, a little bit like what Rick was talking about, they saw a world that they had never seen. And I mean, being in Europe, going across that sea and seeing things that was entirely new. So they brought back those experiences, to the others. The other significant thing it did was it really created the basis for the pan-Indian movements that came along in the following years, where the tribes had always been sort of separate. I mean, that was kind of the way things, in fact, there was a lot of intertribal or tribal conflicts between the tribes. But this meant the tribes had come together during the war years, and it really created the foundation for really working toward other kind of better arrangements, better recognition by the federal government. So in any event, in fact, at the end of World War I, there was a Dr. Joseph Dixon. He and a number of the others led the big efforts to, in fact, get full citizenship for all of the Native Americans. And it was in 1924 that finally happened. But it seems like you've got one good thing on one side and then you've got a bad one. The bad thing is that because of, and again, this back to some of Rick's kind of thing, the segregation, I mean, how the Native Americans were treated and were kept in poverty really meant that, I mean, they were still struggling for so many years and still are, really. And in fact, so that was really the problem. In fact, it was not till 1948 that New Mexico recognized Native American citizenship. So you had the federal government, what it was doing, you had the states, what they were doing, so that there were really kind of multiple layers that were really working against what the Native Americans, were trying to do and seeking to do. So kind of the bottom line of all of this is, on the one hand, the Native Americans and the tribes that we just mentioned, really demonstrated their patriotism, their effectiveness as soldiers, their pride in being soldiers, and that was really very much the positive thing. The other side, the flip side of the coin, is that when they came back, they still faced all this multiple things. In fact, if you look at 45 and what the federal government is doing at the present time, there are huge cutbacks in the proposed federal government budget for Native American issues and support. So while on the one hand there's been progress, on the other hand, today we face really some very, very difficulties, to this very day. So in any case, I think the Code Talkers is a wonderful, interesting, complex story, and I think it really demonstrates the importance of what the Native Americans have brought to our country. So with that, in my 10 minutes, I want to thank Rick again for allowing me to do that. And I want to thank the intellectuals. I know there are others out there. I can just see by your look that I would declare all of you intellectuals that you came on a Saturday afternoon and come to this program. So anyway, thank you very much. So I don't know if there are any questions. I know I have to go and do some other things for my brethren, but yes, ma'am.
Thank you, both of you, for speaking.
You're thanking Rick also? I mean, okay, all right. Okay, that's okay. That's okay.
Good try, Doug.
Okay, all right, okay. No, Rick is wonderful, but yes, go ahead.
Okay, I was born in Fort Worth, and so my education is from Fort Worth, and so a lot of this is new for me because it wasn't part of the curriculum.
Yes, that's right, yeah.
All right. Now, my question is actually to both of you. Were the black soldiers, they probably settled someplace, but for the Native Americans, did they have to go back to a reservation? Or what did they do after their discharge, and how were they discharged?
Well, they were...
Not the ceremonies, but were they federally or legally or officially discharged?
Oh, yeah, and the ones that were soldiers, in fact, Camp Bowie became one of the camps where the soldiers came from a lot of different units and they were discharged. So they would go back to, the reservations per se were kind of going away, and it's really kind of a mixed picture because after the Dawes Act, the land was divided up. So they went back to really what, the circumstances they had, just like the black soldiers. I mean, they went back to the circumstances, and, after World War I, you had a huge amount of discrimination that went on, and the Depression really created all kinds of problems. You had the March on Washington by the soldiers, yes. In other words, yes. So, any other questions from? Oh, yes, ma'am.
I'm not from Fort Worth, so I was...
Oh, I'm sorry. Yeah.
I've always wondered how Camp Bowie got its name. So this is all. I was here for another event and walked into all of this.
Oh.
But with all the various languages of the code talkers, I'm familiar with the story of the Navajo code talkers. So this was all new. How was that communicated amongst the various tribal languages then? If they didn't speak a common language.
Oh, what they did is they matched the language groups together. So at one end and the other end were just Choctaws or Sioux. So they weren't. You're right. They did not mix up the language because they couldn't. If they knew one language, they probably didn't know the other languages. So that was the answer to that.
So amongst groups then, would you have various Native Americans, like in one unit you'd have a Native American from various tribes?
You'd have various tribes. Yeah, so because unlike the black soldiers being kept in one unit, the Native Americans were throughout the units, but there were always probably groupings of the same language groupings there. So any other questions or anything else?
I have a second question then.
Oh, yeah, go ahead.
Camp Bowie, I live out near Carswell Air Force Base. Was that area part of the original? No, it was out to Como, but there are big firing fields out to Weatherford and other areas. But what became the bomber plant in World War II was not part of that original camp. But if you look at the wonderful exhibit stuff out here, Camp Bowie was huge, and it's a fascinating story. So I hope you get a chance to look at all of that. And I think yes. Jim is the father of this, so I don't know what that says about him, but.
Some people call me. I might mention that all of these lectures and presentations are being recorded, and they are all available through YouTube or on our Facebook page, which is North Texas WWI Centennial. So if you missed the one on Camp Bowie or some of the initial ones, this one and all the others that are going to take place in the series will all be available online.
Yeah, and I just want to recognize Jim and all the volunteers that made this, come together. So, anyway, thank you all for being here, and thank Rick. I mean, he did a wonderful thing. And actually, Rick will take you out to lunch if you buy 10 of his books. So, okay.